There is a reason your thoughts slow down when you look up at the night sky, a reason your breathing deepens when you imagine distant stars, silent planets, and endless darkness stretching far beyond anything you can touch. Space does not speak, does not rush, and does not demand attention, and yet something in the human mind responds immediately, almost instinctively, by letting go. This reaction is not poetic. It is neurological. It is ancient, and it is deeply calming. When the mind encounters vastness, something subtle happens. Worries lose their sharp edges. Urgency begins to dissolve. Problems that once felt overwhelming start to feel smaller, lighter, less personal. Space introduces scale not to diminish you, but to steady you. In an infinite universe, the brain no longer needs to stay alert, defensive, or tense. There is nothing to chase, nothing to fix, nothing that requires immediate action. Unlike the noise of everyday life, space offers silence without absence. It is not empty in a threatening way. It is full without being crowded. Stars move slowly. Orbits repeat without urgency. Light travels calmly across unimaginable distances, arriving years later without stress or haste. This rhythm, slow, predictable, and vast, gently retrains the mind to release anxiety and settle into stillness. Tonight, we will explore why the human brain finds comfort in the cosmos, why thinking about galaxies, planets, and cosmic time naturally lowers mental noise, why space feels safe, even though it is unknowably large, and why, when you drift your attention beyond yourself and into the universe, your mind begins to rest without effort. There is nothing you need to understand, nothing you need to remember. Just allow your thoughts to expand, slow, and soften the same way the universe does. As we move gently through space, you may notice your mind doing what it has always known how to do when it feels truly unthreatened. It becomes quiet. When the human mind encounters vastness, something quiet but profound begins to happen. The brain, so accustomed to measuring, categorizing, and controlling its surroundings, suddenly finds itself without edges to hold on to. Space offers no walls, no ceilings, no immediate reference points. Distances stretch far beyond usefulness, sizes exceed comparison, and time itself loosens its grip. In this absence of limits, the mind does something unexpected. It stops tightening. The nervous system, relieved of the need to track threats or manage outcomes, begins to release its constant state of readiness. Vastness does not overwhelm the mind, it disarms it. From an evolutionary perspective, this response is deeply rooted. Anxiety thrives in environments that are dense, noisy, unpredictable, and confined places where danger might emerge suddenly and action is required quickly. Space represents the opposite of this condition. It is open, slow, and indifferent. Nothing in the cosmos reacts to you. Nothing accelerates toward you. Nothing demands a response. When the brain senses this absence of urgency, it gradually powers down its alert systems. Muscles soften, thoughts slow, attention widens instead of narrowing. Scale plays a central role in this calming effect. When the mind contemplates galaxies millions of light years across, or stars that have existed for billions of years, personal concerns lose their intensity. This is not because they become unimportant, but because they are no longer isolated at the center of attention. Space redistributes significance. It places the self back into a larger context, where nothing is required to be solved immediately. In this wider frame, the brain no longer needs to rehearse problems or anticipate outcomes. It is allowed to pause. Neuroscientists describe this shift as a movement from focused, task-oriented thinking toward diffuse awareness. The default mode network of the brain, active during rest, reflection, and calm imagination, becomes more dominant. Space imagery naturally activates this mode. There are no instructions in the stars, no steps to follow, no goals to reach. The mind drifts instead of directs. This drifting is not a loss of control. It is a return to a safer, slower internal rhythm that the brain associates with low threat and high stability. Unlike crowded environments that fragment attention, cosmic scale unifies it. Thoughts stop jumping between concerns and begin to stretch into longer, softer patterns. Mental noise does not disappear abruptly. It thins out, like sound fading with distance. The mind does not become empty, it becomes spacious. There is room for thoughts to pass without friction, without collision, without urgency. This spaciousness is not taught, it is remembered. The brain has always known how to relax when nothing is pressing inward. There is also a subtle emotional safety embedded in vastness. Space is powerful, but it is not intrusive. It does not watch, it does not judge, it does not react. For a mind accustomed to social pressure, expectation, and constant evaluation, this neutrality is deeply soothing. The universe does not care what you accomplish or fail to accomplish. It continues quietly regardless. In this realization, the nervous system finds permission to stand down. As attention lingers on the scale of the cosmos, the mind gradually aligns with it. Breathing slows, inner dialogue softens. The sense of being enclosed by problems loosens. Vastness does not erase the self, it gives it room. And in that room, without effort or instruction, the mind begins to do what it does best. When it feels truly safe, it becomes still. When people imagine silence, they often picture something lacking an absence, a void, a removal of sound or activity. Yet the silence of space is profoundly different from emptiness, as the human mind usually understands it. Space is not silent because nothing exists there. It is silent because nothing interrupts. There are no sudden movements, no sharp signals, no competing demands fighting for attention. This kind of silence does not feel hollow or threatening to the brain. Instead, it feels stable, continuous, and gently supportive, allowing awareness to rest without needing to stay alert. The human nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to interruption, sudden sounds, abrupt changes, unpredictable motion. These are the signals that keep the brain in a state of readiness. Silence on Earth is often temporary and fragile, easily broken, which is why it can feel tense rather than calming. Cosmic silence is different. It is not a pause between noises, it is the natural state. Stars burn without sound. Planets move without friction. Entire galaxies evolve without disturbance. When the mind senses this kind of uninterrupted quiet, it interprets it as safety rather than deprivation. What makes this silence especially soothing is that it carries presence without pressure. Space is full of light, gravity, structure, rhythm, but none of it asks for response. There is no voice to answer, no signal to decode, no instruction to follow. For a brain constantly trained to react, decide, and perform, this absence of demand is deeply regulating. Attention no longer has to scan for relevance. It can simply remain open, unforced, and still. Psychologically, this type of silence allows the mind to disengage from its habitual narrative loops. Thoughts that usually replay themselves, worries, plans, memories, begin to lose momentum when there is nothing external to anchor them. Without cues to react to, the brain stops feeding these loops. Mental activity does not vanish instantly, but it slows, stretches, and gradually softens. Silence becomes not something to fill, but something to settle into. There is also an important distinction between isolation and solitude at work here. Isolation feels threatening because it implies abandonment or vulnerability. Cosmic silence does not suggest either. It is not the silence of being alone, it is the silence of being surrounded by something vast, stable, and indifferent. The universe does not withdraw from you, it simply exists without engaging. This neutrality reassures the nervous system that nothing is required, nothing is missing, and nothing is about to intrude. In this environment, awareness naturally widens. Instead of focusing tightly on a single concern, the mind begins to distribute attention more evenly. Thoughts feel less sharp, less urgent, less personal. Silence becomes a container rather than a gap, a space where experiences can pass through without friction. This is why imagining space often leads to slower breathing and a softened emotional state. The brain is responding to an environment where vigilance is unnecessary. Over time, this silence reshapes internal rhythm. The mind starts to mirror the universe it is contemplating. Just as stars do not rush their fusion and planets do not hurry their orbits, thoughts no longer race toward conclusions. There is no reward for speed here. Nothing arrives suddenly. Everything unfolds gradually. In this alignment, silence stops feeling like the absence of sound and becomes something far more nourishing. A steady, unbroken calm that allows the mind to rest without effort. And as this quiet continues, the distinction between inner and outer silence begins to blur. The vast, soundless universe and the slowing mind reflect one another, each reinforcing the other's stillness. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. In the presence of silence without absence, the brain finally recognizes a condition it instinctively trusts. It settles, not because it is told to, but because nothing is asking it not to. When the mind turns towards space, it does not only encounter vast distances and quiet silence, it also encounters a radically different sense of time. Cosmic time moves at a pace so slow, so patient, that it barely resembles the ticking rhythm that governs daily life. Stars take millions of years to change noticeably. Galaxies rotate over spans that exceed the entire history of human civilization. Nothing in space rushes, and nothing arrives suddenly. When the brain absorbs this scale of time, its internal tempo begins to adjust, loosening the tight grip of urgency that fuels anxiety. Anxiety thrives on compressed time. It feeds on deadlines, anticipation, and the feeling that something must happen soon, or else something will go wrong. The nervous system becomes activated when the future feels close and demanding. Cosmic time does the opposite. It stretches the future so far away that immediacy dissolves. When you imagine processes unfolding over billions of years, the brain no longer treats the next few minutes or hours as critical turning points. The sense of pressure weakens, and with it, the physiological signals of stress begin to fade. This slowing effect is not imaginary, it is neurological. The brain continuously estimates time, adjusting attention and arousal based on how quickly change is expected to occur. In environments where change is rapid and unpredictable, the brain stays tense and alert. In environments perceived as slow and stable, it relaxes. Space represents the ultimate stable environment. Nothing shifts suddenly, nothing accelerates without warning. When the mind aligns with this perception, it recalibrates its expectations, allowing thoughts to unfold more gradually and with less emotional charge. As thoughts slow, they also lose their sharpness. Instead of arriving in quick, fragmented bursts, they stretch into longer, softer forms. Worries that once repeated themselves rapidly begin to feel less urgent, less convincing. The mind has more space between thoughts, more room to let them pass without engagement. This spacing is essential for calm. Anxiety compresses experience. Cosmic time expands it. In that expansion, mental tension naturally releases. There is also comfort in the predictability of cosmic time. Orbits repeat. Cycles return. Stars follow lifespans that, while vast, are remarkably consistent. The universe does not surprise itself. For the human brain, which is constantly scanning for unexpected change, this predictability is deeply reassuring. It signals an environment where nothing needs to be anticipated aggressively. The future exists, but it unfolds according to rhythms far slower than fear requires. When attention rests on these immense timelines, personal narratives begin to soften. Problems that feel overwhelming within a short time frame lose intensity when placed against billions of years. This is not dismissal or denial, it is perspective. The mind recognizes that not everything must be resolved immediately to remain safe. Cosmic time teaches patience, not as a discipline, but as a condition. The universe itself demonstrates that continuation does not require urgency. Over time, this perception gently rewires expectation. The brain becomes less reactive, less inclined to rush toward conclusions or brace for immediate outcomes. Breathing slows in response. Heart rate steadies. The body receives the signal that there is time, more than enough time, for things to unfold naturally. In this state, anxiety finds little traction. There is nothing to hurry toward and nothing pressing from behind. As the mind synchronizes with cosmic time, it begins to feel held within a larger, slower flow. Thoughts drift rather than race. Emotions settle rather than spike. The present moment stretches comfortably, no longer squeezed between regrets of the past and fears of the future. Space does not eliminate time. It transforms how time is felt. And in that transformation, the mind discovers one of the deepest sources of calm it can know: the quiet assurance that nothing needs to happen quickly for everything to be okay. As attention drifts outward into the scale of the universe, something subtle yet transformative occurs in how the mind relates to itself. The self, which often feels like the center of every experience, begins to soften at its edges. Thoughts that once revolved tightly around personal concerns loosen their orbit. Worries do not disappear, but they change size. They no longer fill the entire field of awareness. Against the backdrop of infinite space, the mind naturally recalibrates what deserves urgency and what can be allowed to rest. In daily life, anxiety thrives on proximity. Problems feel overwhelming when they appear close, immediate, and all-encompassing. The universe introduces distance in the most profound way possible. When awareness stretches to include galaxies, nebulae, and star systems unimaginably far away, the mind instinctively shifts scale. Personal struggles remain real, but they no longer dominate perception. They become part of a much larger landscape, one in which no single event defines the whole. This widening of perspective does not minimize experience, it stabilizes it. There is a neurological basis for this shift. The brain constantly evaluates importance by comparing signals. When the field of attention is narrow, small stimuli can feel enormous. When the field widens, intensity redistributes. Space provides the widest possible field. Against cosmic scale, the brain reduces the emotional amplification it normally applies to immediate concerns. Stress responses soften. Rumination slows. The nervous system recognizes that survival does not depend on resolving every detail right now. This perspective also dissolves the illusion of isolation. Anxiety often convinces the mind that it is alone with its problems, trapped within a small and fragile frame. The universe quietly contradicts this narrative. Everything that exists is embedded in something vastly larger, governed by forces that do not single out individuals. Stars form and fade. Planets drift, galaxies evolve. Nothing is required to justify its presence. In this context, the self no longer feels like a point under pressure, but like a participant within a much broader, steadier system. As the sense of centrality fades, responsibility lightens. The mind is no longer tasked with holding everything together. Cosmic perspective reminds awareness that the universe has continued for billions of years without instruction or control. This realization gently loosens the need to manage outcomes, predict every possibility, or guard against every future moment. Control relaxes not because it is surrendered deliberately, but because it is no longer necessary to feel safe. There is also comfort in the impersonality of space. The universe does not evaluate, compare, or judge. It does not react to success or failure. For a mind shaped by social expectation and self-criticism, this neutrality is deeply soothing. Within cosmic scale, there is no audience, no scorekeeping, no urgency to perform. Existence is permitted without justification. The nervous system receives this permission and responds by lowering its guard. Over time, worries begin to feel less absolute. They are no longer framed as defining events, but as temporary patterns passing through awareness. Space teaches the mind that continuity does not require constant intervention. Just as planets remain in orbit without effort, thoughts can arise and pass without being held. The self remains present, but it no longer feels compressed by its own concerns. As perspective continues to widen, the mind discovers a quiet humility that is deeply calming. Not the humility of insignificance, but the humility of belonging. To exist within an infinite universe is not to be reduced, but to be placed within something vast enough to absorb worry without amplifying it, large enough to hold experience without demanding resolution. In this placement, the mind finally releases its grip on urgency and allows itself to rest, supported by a universe that does not require it to be anything more than present. When the mind begins to attune itself to space, it does not only encounter vastness and silence, but rhythm, a rhythm unlike anything found in human schedules or daily life. In space, nothing moves because it is late, early, or expected. Nothing accelerates to meet a deadline. Planets orbit because they always have. Stars burn because that is their nature. Galaxies rotate slowly, patiently, completing motions that take hundreds of millions of years without the slightest sense of hurry. When the brain senses this kind of rhythm, something deeply ingrained begins to unwind. Urgency loses its authority. Human anxiety is closely tied to artificial rhythm alarms, clocks, notifications, calendars, signals that fragment time into demands. The nervous system learns to live in short intervals, constantly anticipating the next requirement. Cosmic rhythm offers the opposite experience. Orbits repeat without pressure. Cycles return without expectation. There is no penalty for delay, no reward for speed. When the mind imagines these motions, it begins to disengage from time as a series of obligations and reconnects with time as a continuous flow. This shift alone is enough to reduce mental tension. There is something profoundly reassuring about repetition without consequence. The moon does not fear missing its orbit. A planet does not worry about falling behind. Even chaotic-looking systems in space follow deep, stable patterns over long durations. For the brain, which evolved to find safety in predictability, this is deeply soothing. The universe demonstrates that order does not require constant correction. Stability does not depend on vigilance. Things continue simply because they are allowed to. As attention lingers on these cosmic cycles, the mind begins to mirror them. Thoughts no longer surge forward aggressively. They start to move in gentle loops, returning and drifting away without escalation. Mental stillness does not arrive suddenly. It emerges gradually as the internal rhythm slows. Just as an orbit maintains balance through motion rather than force, the mind finds calm not by stopping thought, but by allowing it to circulate without resistance. This is why space imagery often feels hypnotic. Watching stars drift or imagining planets circling quietly engages the brain's pattern recognition systems without triggering urgency. The mind becomes absorbed without becoming tense. Attention settles into a steady, effortless focus. In this state, the brain does not scan for threats or outcomes. It simply observes continuity. Anxiety, which relies on interruption and anticipation, finds little room to operate here. There is also comfort in the impersonality of cosmic rhythm. These cycles do not depend on human presence or participation. They existed long before awareness and will continue long after. This removes the subtle pressure many minds carry, the feeling that something must be maintained, managed, or upheld. Space makes it clear that rhythm does not need caretakers. The universe moves on its own. The mind, sensing this, begins to release its habit of constant oversight. Over time, this exposure to rhythm without urgency reshapes internal expectations. The body slows naturally. Breathing deepens without instruction. Heart rate steadies. Thoughts stretch farther apart. The mind no longer feels compelled to rush toward conclusions or brace for what comes next. It learns, quietly, that movement does not require stress and that continuity does not require effort. In aligning with cosmic cycles, the mind returns to a more natural state, one where time is experienced as a wide, steady presence rather than a sequence of demands. Orbits continue, patterns repeat, nothing is late, nothing is early. And within this rhythm, mental stillness emerges not as something imposed, but as something remembered. The universe does not hurry, and as the mind follows its lead, it finally allows itself to slow. When the mind turns its attention to light traveling through space, it encounters a form of patience so complete that it gently dissolves the habit of urgency. Light does not rush, even though it moves at the fastest speed the universe allows. It simply proceeds, uninterrupted, across distances so large that the journey itself becomes the dominant feature. A beam leaving a distant star may travel for thousands, millions, or even billions of years before reaching anything at all. In this slow inevitability, the mind recognizes a calm that has nothing to do with speed and everything to do with continuity. Human anxiety often arises from immediacy messages that arrive instantly, responses expected without delay, outcomes demanded now rather than later. Light in space offers a radically different narrative. Signals take time, enormous time. Nothing arrives suddenly. Nothing demands acknowledgement upon arrival. When awareness lingers on this fact, the brain's expectation of immediacy begins to soften. The nervous system, no longer primed for instant reaction, gradually releases its tension. There is time. There has always been time. There is something deeply stabilizing about knowing that what you see in the night sky is already old. Starlight reaching your eyes tonight began its journey long before you existed. It carries no urgency, no instruction, no requirement for response. It simply arrives, quietly completing a path that was set in motion ages ago. For the brain, this reframes perception itself. Experience becomes less about reacting to the present and more about receiving something that has been unfolding patiently, independent of awareness. This distance between emission and arrival introduces a gentle buffer that the mind instinctively trusts. Anxiety thrives when cause and effect feel compressed, when actions seem to demand immediate consequences. Cosmic light stretches this relationship across time so vast that pressure dissolves. Nothing in space expects acknowledgement. Nothing waits for validation. Light travels because it always has, not because it needs to reach you. In sensing this, the mind releases its habit of urgency and settles into a slower mode of attention. There is also comfort in the reliability of this process. Light does not hesitate, it does not deviate, it does not check whether its journey will be noticed or understood. It moves steadily, indifferent to observation. This predictability signals safety to the nervous system. Stable processes, especially those that unfold without interruption, allow the brain to disengage from constant monitoring. Attention widens. Thoughts soften. The need to stay alert diminishes. As the mind contemplates light crossing vast emptiness, internal pacing begins to adjust. Thoughts slow to match the scale of the journey. Mental events that once felt urgent now feel distant, less demanding. There is space between impulses, space between worries, space between reactions. This spacing is essential for calm. The brain learns, through imagination and perception, that not everything arrives immediately, and that nothing dangerous follows from waiting. This experience also dissolves the illusion of being at the center of events. Light does not aim for you. It does not care who receives it. It simply exists, moving through space until something happens to be in its path. In this realization, the self relaxes its sense of importance without feeling diminished. The universe is not responding to you, and nothing is expected in return. This neutrality is profoundly soothing, allowing awareness to rest without self-reference. Over time, exposure to this idea reshapes expectation. The brain becomes less reactive, less inclined to interpret delay as threat. Waiting no longer feels like failure. Distance no longer feels like loss. The mind accepts that processes can unfold far beyond immediate perception and still be complete. Light teaches patience, not as discipline, but as structure. It demonstrates that arrival does not need to be fast to be meaningful. As attention remains with these slow signals, calm deepens naturally. Breathing follows a steadier rhythm. Thoughts drift rather than collide. The mind aligns itself with a universe where messages take years to arrive and nothing is urgent. In this alignment, anxiety finds no anchor. There is nothing to rush toward, nothing pressing from behind, only light moving quietly across space, and awareness moving just as gently alongside it. When the mind begins to recognize structure in the universe, a specific and deeply calming realization emerges. Order does not require control. In daily life, order is often maintained through effort. Schedules must be managed, systems must be monitored, outcomes must be adjusted. This constant requirement for oversight keeps the nervous system alert, scanning for errors and deviations. Space offers a radically different model. Galaxies hold their shape without supervision. Orbits remain stable without correction. Vast structures persist across billions of years without anyone guiding them. When the brain encounters this kind of self-sustaining order, it begins to relax its instinct to manage everything. This reassurance operates below conscious thought. The brain evolved to associate stability with safety. When patterns hold over time, when systems remain coherent without disruption, the nervous system interprets the environment as non-threatening. Cosmic structure is the most stable structure the mind can imagine. Spiral galaxies maintain their form across unimaginable durations. Star clusters remain bound by gravity without drifting apart. Even chaos in space follows statistical rules that keep the whole intact. This consistency signals to the brain that existence does not depend on constant intervention. Anxiety often arises from the belief that if attention lapses, something will go wrong. The universe quietly disproves this belief. No one is watching the stars to ensure they rise. No intelligence recalculates planetary paths each moment. Order emerges naturally from fundamental forces, repeating itself without awareness or intention. When the mind absorbs this, it begins to question its own compulsion to oversee every detail. If the universe can maintain coherence at the largest scale, perhaps not everything needs to be held so tightly. This shift is deeply physiological. The brain's control centers, responsible for prediction and correction, become less dominant when perceived threat decreases. Attention moves away from hypervigilance and toward observation. Thoughts no longer circle obsessively around potential failures. Instead, they slow, aligning with the steady persistence of cosmic patterns. The mind learns that structure can exist without stress and that continuity does not require force. This learning does not happen through logic, but through resonance. There is also comfort in the impersonality of cosmic order. Nothing in space is arranged to please or punish. Structures exist because they are allowed to, not because they succeed or fail. For a mind accustomed to evaluation and comparison, this neutrality is deeply regulating. The universe does not keep score. It does not optimize. It does not rush improvement. It simply unfolds according to principles that do not fluctuate with mood or intention. In sensing this, the nervous system releases the pressure of performance. As awareness rests on this self-organizing order, internal tension continues to ease. The mind no longer feels solely responsible for maintaining coherence. It begins to trust that systems can hold without constant input. Breathing slows, muscles release, thoughts feel less brittle, less urgent. Control gives way to alignment. Instead of pushing against experience, awareness starts to move with it, carried by patterns that do not need to be directed. Over time, this exposure reshapes the relationship between mind and environment. The universe becomes a reference point for stability rather than uncertainty. Even the unknown feels structured rather than chaotic. There may be mysteries, but they exist within a framework that remains intact. This realization offers profound calm. The brain no longer needs to anticipate collapse at every moment. It recognizes that order is not fragile, it is fundamental, and within that recognition, the mind finally allows itself to rest, supported by a cosmos that holds together without effort. When the mind contemplates space long enough, a quiet emotional shift begins to occur, a sense of belonging that does not depend on identity, achievement, or recognition. This belonging is not social and not personal. It does not arise from being seen or understood. It arises from placement. The realization that you exist times within times, a universe, rather than times against times, it softens something deep in the nervous system. There is relief in knowing that nothing about existence requires justification. Stars do not earn their place. Galaxies do not explain themselves. They simply are. And the mind, sensing this, begins to allow itself the same permission. Much of human anxiety is rooted in conditional belonging. The feeling that safety, acceptance, or worth must be maintained through effort. Space offers a model of unconditional inclusion. Everything that exists is already part of the whole. There is no boundary one must cross to belong to the universe. Existence itself is the admission. When awareness absorbs this, the constant background tension of self-evaluation begins to loosen. The brain no longer needs to ask whether it fits, whether it is enough, or whether it has earned its place. Belonging is no longer something to secure. It is something already given. This realization has a powerful regulatory effect on the nervous system. The brain is highly sensitive to exclusion and threat of removal, which is why social and existential anxieties feel so intense. Cosmic perspective dissolves this threat entirely. There is no outside of the universe to be pushed into. Nothing that exists can be removed from existence itself. This absolute inclusion creates a sense of safety that is difficult to achieve through logic alone. The body responds by lowering its guard, easing muscle tension, and allowing attention to soften rather than brace. There is also comfort in the anonymity of cosmic belonging. Space does not single you out. It does not spotlight or isolate. You are not required to stand apart or stand out. You are one presence among countless others, all held by the same laws, the same gravity, the same unfolding of time. For a mind exhausted by comparison and self-reference, this anonymity is not diminishing, it is freeing. The pressure to define oneself relaxes. Identity becomes lighter, less rigid, less defended. As this sense of effortless belonging settles in, the mind begins to release its habit of constant positioning. There is no need to prove relevance in a universe that does not rank. No need to justify rest in a cosmos that never hurries. The self stops feeling like a fragile point that must be protected and begins to feel like a natural occurrence, no more accidental than a star forming or a planet drifting through space. This reframing quietly dissolves existential tension that often sits beneath conscious thought. Belonging without effort also changes how the mind experiences solitude. Being alone no longer feels like separation when awareness includes the vast environment that surrounds all things. Space is not empty companionship. It is presence without demand. In this presence, solitude becomes spacious rather than isolating. The mind does not feel abandoned. It feels held not by intention, but by structure. Gravity, time, and continuity replace the need for reassurance. Over time, this sense of cosmic belonging reshapes emotional expectations. The mind becomes less reactive to perceived rejection, less sensitive to evaluation, less fearful of disappearance. Existence feels stable, not because it is controlled, but because it is embedded. You are not balanced on the edge of being. You are already inside it. This understanding does not arrive as a thought. It arrives as a feeling of steadiness, a subtle grounding that spreads through awareness without effort. As attention continues to rest in this perspective, the body mirrors the mind's calm. Breathing becomes slower and deeper. The chest softens. Thoughts no longer cluster tightly around the self. They drift outward, blending into a wider field of awareness where nothing needs to be defended or asserted. Belonging is no longer something the mind seeks. It is something it remembers. And in this remembering, a deep psychological comfort settles in. The universe does not promise happiness, success, or certainty, but it does offer inclusion without condition. Everything that exists is already part of the whole, moving within patterns that do not exclude or judge. In recognizing this, the mind finally releases its need to struggle for place. It rests quietly and naturally inside a cosmos where belonging has never required effort at all. When attention moves outward into space, distance itself becomes a calming force. Not distance measured in meters or miles, but psychological distance, the widening gap between immediate concerns and the broader context in which they exist. The human mind is finely tuned to react to what feels close. Proximity amplifies importance. Near threats feel urgent. Near problems feel demanding. Space introduces a scale of distance so extreme that the mind can no longer maintain this amplification. Against the backdrop of stars and galaxies, mental noise begins to lose its intensity, not through effort, but through proportion. Mental noise is sustained by compression. Thoughts overlap, concerns stack tightly, and attention narrows until every small issue feels unavoidable. Distance uncompresses this field. When awareness includes cosmic scale, the brain automatically expands its frame of reference. Events are no longer evaluated in isolation, but as part of a much larger unfolding. This expansion does not dismiss problems. It redistributes attention so that no single thought can dominate the entire mental space. The result is not emptiness, but clarity without pressure. There is a deeply biological reason for this effect. The brain evolved to prioritize what is near because proximity once determined survival. What was far away rarely required immediate action. Space imagery exploits this ancient mechanism in a gentle way. When the mind contemplates distant planets or light years of emptiness, the brain interprets the environment as non-immediate and non-threatening. Stress hormones begin to settle. Vigilance softens. The nervous system receives the signal that nothing close requires defense or decision. As distance increases, the mind's internal commentary begins to slow. Thoughts that usually repeat themselves lose momentum when they are no longer reinforced by urgency. The familiar inner dialogue planning, worrying, rehearsing, fades into the background, not because it is silenced, but because it is no longer necessary. The brain stops scanning for immediate relevance. Attention becomes observational rather than reactive. In this mode, mental noise thins naturally, like sound dissipating across open space. Distance also disrupts the illusion that everything depends on personal action. Anxiety often arises from the belief that outcomes hinge on constant intervention. Cosmic perspective quietly contradicts this belief. The universe continues regardless of individual effort. Stars form, burn, and fade without consultation. Orbits remain stable without supervision. When the mind senses this continuity, it releases the pressure to manage every outcome. Responsibility lightens. Thoughts no longer carry the weight of necessity. There is a subtle emotional relief in realizing that not every thought deserves equal attention. Distance teaches selectivity without force. The mind learns that it can observe a concern without entering it, acknowledge a thought without following it. Space does not pull attention inward, it allows it to remain wide. In this widened field, mental events appear smaller, less intrusive, easier to let pass. Noise gives way to spaciousness, not through control, but through context. Over time, this shift reshapes the rhythm of thinking itself. Thoughts arrive more slowly, pauses lengthen. Awareness spends more time between thoughts than inside them. This is not dissociation or detachment, it is balance. The mind remains present, but it is no longer crowded by its own activity. Distance has done what effort could not. It has reduced noise by expanding the field in which thought appears. As attention continues to rest within this expanded perspective, calm deepens, breathing steadies. The body follows the mind's cue that nothing is pressing close. Mental space feels open, breathable, and stable. Distance becomes not a separation from experience, but a gentle buffer that allows experience to unfold without pressure. In the vastness of space, the mind discovers a simple truth it has always responded to instinctively. When nothing is close, nothing needs to be loud. As awareness continues to expand into cosmic scale, the mind begins to experience a form of relief that does not come from solving problems, but from outgrowing their confinement. Thoughts feel heavy when the mental field is small. In a narrow space, even gentle ideas collide, overlap, and amplify one another. Space offers the opposite condition. It does not push thoughts away, it gives them room. In this widened field, mental activity no longer needs to compete for attention. Each thought can arise, linger briefly, and dissolve without pressure, because there is more than enough space for everything to exist without interference. This expansion occurs without instruction or discipline. The mind does not need to force itself to think less. It simply adjusts to the environment it is contemplating. When awareness includes vast distances, immense scales, and slow-moving structures, internal processes naturally recalibrate. The brain stops compressing experience. It stops stacking concerns tightly together. Instead, it distributes attention across a broader internal landscape. Thoughts become lighter, not because they are suppressed, but because they are no longer crowded. Anxiety often feels intense because the mind treats every thought as if it were happening in the same small room. Worry presses against memory, anticipation presses against fear, reflection presses against planning. In cosmic awareness, that room disappears. There are no walls for thoughts to echo against. Each idea has space to exist independently, without amplifying the next. This separation reduces emotional charge. Thoughts no longer feel urgent simply because they exist. They are allowed to be present without demanding reaction. From a neurological perspective, this wider field reduces the dominance of threat-based processing. The brain's alarm systems are activated when stimuli appear dense, immediate, and overlapping. A spacious mental field signals the opposite. It communicates safety through abundance. There is enough room, enough time, enough distance. As this signal repeats, the nervous system gradually releases its defensive posture. Attention shifts from vigilance to observation. The mind watches itself gently, without the need to intervene. This expansion also changes the relationship between attention and identity. In a narrow field, thoughts feel personal, central, defining. In a wide field, they feel contextual. They are something that happens within awareness rather than something that times is times awareness. Space teaches the mind that it is larger than its content. Thoughts are events, not occupants. They pass through rather than take residence. This realization does not require belief. It emerges naturally when awareness has room to notice movement without being carried by it. As the mental field continues to widen, silence begins to appear between thoughts, not forced silence, but natural gaps. These gaps are deeply restorative. They allow the brain to reset, to return briefly to baseline before the next idea arises. Over time, these pauses lengthen. Thought becomes more deliberate, less automatic. Mental noise decreases, not by elimination, but by dilution. In a vast field, noise cannot dominate. There is also emotional safety in this expansion. When the mind feels wide, emotions are less likely to overwhelm. Feelings can arise fully without overtaking awareness. Sadness does not flood the entire field. Worry does not fill every corner. Each emotion occupies its own space, complete but contained. This containment does not restrict feeling, it supports it. Space holds emotion gently, preventing it from collapsing inward into distress. Over time, the mind learns to prefer this expanded state. It recognizes the difference between tight attention and wide attention, between crowded awareness and spacious awareness. Cosmic imagery becomes a doorway back into this state. Whenever mental noise increases, the universe does not need to intervene. Its scale alone is enough. Awareness aligns with it, expanding naturally, without effort, into a field where thoughts no longer press inward, but drift freely across a vast and quiet internal sky. As awareness remains extended into cosmic distance, the mind encounters a form of safety that is rarely experienced in daily life: stability without responsiveness. On Earth, most environments react. Sounds answer sounds. Movements trigger movements. Expressions invite responses. This constant feedback keeps the brain alert, scanning for social cues, threats, and changes that might require adjustment. Space offers a radically different condition. It does not respond. It does not react. It does not mirror attention back toward the observer. In this non-reactivity, the nervous system finds a deep and unfamiliar calm. The brain evolved to be vigilant in reactive environments. Sudden changes once signaled danger or opportunity. Today, that same vigilance is triggered by notifications, conversations, and unpredictable events. Cosmic distance removes this trigger entirely. Stars do not notice being watched. Galaxies do not shift in response to observation. Nothing in space acknowledges presence. This absence of feedback tells the brain that nothing is being demanded, evaluated, or negotiated. Without the need to monitor response, vigilance begins to dissolve. This non-reactivity creates a unique psychological safety. In environments that react, attention must remain sharp to manage outcomes. In an environment that remains unchanged, regardless of attention, the brain can rest. Space does not accelerate when observed, nor does it withdraw when ignored. It remains constant. This constancy signals predictability at the deepest level. The nervous system interprets predictability as safety, allowing stress responses to stand down without instruction or effort. As the mind settles into this stability, internal processes follow suit. Thoughts slow because there is no external pressure to keep pace. Emotions soften because there is no feedback loop amplifying them. Even self-awareness becomes gentler. Without an environment that reflects or reacts, the sense of being watched or judged fades. The self no longer feels exposed. Awareness turns inward without tension, observing experience without bracing for reaction. There is also relief in realizing that nothing in space depends on immediate interpretation. On Earth, misreading a signal can have consequences. In cosmic contemplation, there is nothing to misinterpret. A star remains a star regardless of understanding. This removes the subtle cognitive strain of constant decoding. The brain no longer needs to translate signals into meaning quickly. It can observe slowly, allowing perception to unfold without urgency or correction. This distance from reaction also reduces emotional reactivity. Feelings often intensify when they appear to provoke consequences. In a non-reactive environment, Emotions are allowed to exist without escalation. Sadness does not need to defend itself. Joy does not need to be contained. Both can arise and pass without altering the environment. This teaches the mind a quiet lesson. Experience can be felt fully without requiring response. The nervous system relaxes into this permission. As awareness continues to rest within this stable distance, the mind begins to trust stillness. It recognizes that nothing collapses when attention softens. Nothing is lost when vigilance eases. The universe does not change its course when observed quietly. This trust extends inward. The mind learns that it can stop managing without falling apart. Thoughts can slow without consequence. Attention can widen without danger. Over time, this stability becomes internalized. The mind carries a sense of non-reactive space within itself. Even when returning to more responsive environments, this memory of cosmic distance remains available. It serves as a reference point for calm, a reminder that not everything requires engagement, and not every signal demands response. In the vast, steady presence of space, the brain learns a fundamental truth. Safety does not always come from control. Sometimes it comes from distance that does not move, react, or ask anything in return. As awareness continues to rest within vast, non-reactive distance, a final and subtle shift begins to take place inside the mind. The constant inner narration, the voice that explains, evaluates, comments, and predicts, starts to lose its urgency. This voice is not silenced abruptly, nor is it forced into stillness. It simply finds less reason to speak. In a universe that does not respond, does not judge, and does not require interpretation, narration becomes optional. Thought slows not because it is restrained, but because nothing is asking it to perform. The inner voice evolved as a tool for navigation. It helps anticipate danger, organize action, and maintain social alignment. In environments dense with signals and consequences, this narration is essential. Space removes those conditions entirely. There is nothing to prepare for, nothing to explain to anyone, nothing to resolve. As the mind recognizes this, it gradually releases the habit of constant commentary. Words arrive more slowly. Sentences feel less necessary. Silence between thoughts becomes longer and more comfortable. This quieting does not reduce awareness. In fact, it deepens it. Without constant narration, perception becomes more direct. Sensations, images, and feelings are experienced without being immediately translated into language. The mind begins to rest in raw presence rather than description. This is deeply calming for the nervous system. Language requires precision and control. Presence does not. In space-based awareness, experience is allowed to be felt without being managed. Anxiety often relies on narration to sustain itself. Worry repeats itself through words. Fear is rehearsed through imagined dialogue. When narration softens, anxiety loses one of its primary supports. Thoughts may still arise, but they are no longer reinforced by continuous verbal framing. A concern appears, floats briefly, and fades without being wrapped in explanation. The mind discovers that it does not need to comment on everything it experiences in order to remain safe. There is also a deep sense of relief in releasing the need to make sense of everything immediately. Meaning is no longer extracted moment by moment. The universe does not explain itself, and yet it remains coherent. In mirroring this, The mind allows experience to unfold without demanding interpretation. This reduces cognitive effort dramatically. Attention no longer tightens around understanding. It opens into observation, allowing things to be as they are. As narration recedes, time begins to feel less segmented, without inner commentary marking moments as significant or insignificant. Experience flows more evenly, the present stretches. There is less sense of moving from one mental event to the next. Instead, awareness rests in a continuous field where thoughts appear like distant stars, noticeable but not intrusive. This continuity is deeply soothing. It signals to the brain that nothing requires immediate categorization or response. This state also reduces self-consciousness. The inner voice often reinforces identity by constantly referring back to the self, what this means for me, what I should do, how this appears. In cosmic awareness, this reference loop weakens. Experience is no longer centered tightly around identity. It becomes more spacious, less personal, and therefore less demanding. The self does not disappear. It relaxes into the background, no longer required to supervise every moment. Over time, the mind learns to trust silence, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of sufficiency. Nothing feels missing when narration pauses. Awareness remains intact, stable, and grounded. The universe does not speak, yet it continues flawlessly. In aligning with this, the mind realizes that it too can remain whole without constant explanation. Thought becomes something that arises when useful, not something that must run continuously. In this quieting of the inner voice, a profound calm settles in. The mind is no longer crowded by its own commentary. Attention rests in a wide, steady presence where thoughts drift through without obligation. Space does not demand words, and neither does awareness. In the vast, patient silence of the cosmos, the mind finally understands that it is allowed to be quiet not because it has finished thinking, but because it no longer needs to narrate existence in order to feel safe within it. As awareness settles into the vast, steady qualities of space, the calming effect does not remain confined to thought alone. It moves downward, quietly and unmistakably, into the body. The nervous system, which has been listening carefully all along, begins to interpret the cosmic environment as fundamentally safe. Not safe because it is familiar, controllable, or protective, but safe because it is non-intrusive, predictable at scale, and entirely indifferent to immediate reaction. This distinction matters. Safety for the nervous system is not about comfort. It is about the absence of threat signals. Space provides this absence completely. The human body is constantly scanning for danger through subtle cues. Sudden movement, sharp sound, unpredictable change, social tension, or spatial confinement. These cues activate the sympathetic nervous system, preparing the body to act. When the mind contemplates space, these cues vanish. There is no sudden approach, no looming object, no narrowing corridor. Everything is distant, slow, and expansive. The body receives this information not intellectually, but somatically. Muscles begin to release their low-level tension. Breathing deepens without instruction. The baseline state of alertness begins to soften. What makes space especially powerful as a signal of safety is its consistency. Threats on Earth often come from change, something new entering the environment, something unexpected shifting the balance. Space does not change abruptly. Stars do not lunge. Galaxies do not surprise. Even violent cosmic events unfold over timescales so long that they are perceived as gradual rather than sudden. The nervous system trusts this consistency. It recognizes an environment where nothing is about to happen, times to you asterisk. This recognition allows defensive systems to stand down. As the body relaxes, the parasympathetic nervous system becomes more active. This is the system responsible for rest, digestion, recovery, and restoration. Heart rate slows, blood pressure eases, internal rhythms become smoother and more synchronized. This shift is not forced through breathing techniques or conscious relaxation. It happens naturally because the environment being imagined contains no cues that require readiness. Space does not invite action, it invites stillness. There is also an important spatial element at work. Confinement increases stress, open environments reduce it. Space is the most open environment the mind can conceive. There are no edges pressing inward, no boundaries closing in. This openness communicates freedom of movement at a deep biological level, even though no movement is required. The body interprets this as an absence of entrapment. Should movement ever be needed, there is room. This perception alone reduces unconscious tension held in the chest, shoulders, and abdomen. As bodily safety increases, emotional regulation improves. Emotions no longer spike as easily because the nervous system is no longer primed for defense. Feelings can arise and pass without triggering physical escalation. Anxiety loses its physical fuel. Restlessness fades. Even discomfort feels more manageable when the body is not simultaneously bracing for threat. Space teaches the body that it is allowed to exist without guarding itself. Over time, this sense of safety becomes internalized. The nervous system learns that calm is not dependent on external control or reassurance. It is a state that can arise naturally when threat signals are absent. Cosmic awareness provides a template for this state: wide, slow, non-reactive, and indifferent. The body remembers this template. Even after attention shifts, the imprint remains, available as a reference point for rest. As the body continues to settle, the boundary between mental calm and physical calm dissolves. Thought, breath, and posture align into a single, coherent rhythm. Nothing needs to be adjusted. Nothing needs to be corrected. The universe does not lean in, and neither does the body. In the presence of space, the nervous system finally recognizes an environment where vigilance is unnecessary, and in that recognition, it allows itself to rest fully, deeply, and without resistance. As the nervous system continues to recognize space as safe, another quiet alignment begins to unfold, the synchronization of inner rhythm with the vast, steady rhythm of the cosmos. Breathing, which often becomes shallow and irregular under stress, begins to slow naturally. There is no instruction to inhale deeply or exhale slowly. The body simply adjusts, responding to an environment where nothing is accelerating toward it and nothing is required immediately. Space does not rush, and in sensing this, the breath learns that it does not need to rush either. Breathing is one of the most direct bridges between mind and body. When danger is perceived, breath shortens to prepare for action. When safety is perceived, breath lengthens to support rest. Cosmic awareness communicates safety in the purest possible form. There are no sudden changes in pressure, no approaching figures, no narrowing passages. Everything remains distant and stable. The respiratory system receives this signal and begins to adopt a slower, more efficient pattern, one that supports calm rather than readiness. As breath slows, the heart follows. Heart rate variability increases, signaling a shift toward balance and recovery. This is not a technique being applied. It is a physiological response to perceived environment. The universe, vast and unchanging, offers a model of continuity without interruption. The body mirrors this continuity internally. Each breath becomes smoother, less segmented, less effortful. The pause between breaths grows longer, and in that pause, the nervous system deepens its sense of safety. This alignment has a cascading effect. With each slower breath, carbon dioxide levels stabilize, reducing the physiological triggers that often sustain anxiety. The body no longer interprets internal sensations as threats. Muscles soften further, the jaw unclenches, the shoulders release their habitual lift. Space, by offering an environment without urgency, allows the body to exit its default state of low-grade tension and enter a mode of restoration. There is something deeply reassuring about the scale of cosmic rhythm. Planets orbit with perfect patience. Stars pulse over millions of years. Even the expansion of the universe unfolds so gradually that it feels almost still. When the mind contemplates these rhythms, it stops imposing artificial pacing on the body. Breathing no longer tries to keep up with thought. Thought slows to match breath. The entire system begins to move as a single, integrated whole. This synchronization also reduces the sense of internal fragmentation. Under stress, the mind and body often feel misaligned thoughts racing, while the body feels tense or exhausted. Cosmic rhythm gently resolves this mismatch. Awareness widens, breath deepens, thought softens. There is no longer a need to coordinate or correct. Everything begins to move together, guided by an external reference that does not fluctuate or demand adjustment. As this state deepens, breathing becomes almost imperceptible. It continues steadily, quietly, without drawing attention to itself. The body no longer uses breath as a tool to manage emotion. It simply breathes because breathing is allowed to be natural again. In this condition, the nervous system settles into its most efficient state, conserving energy and supporting repair. The universe does not instruct the body to rest. It simply creates the conditions where rest becomes inevitable. Over time, this pattern imprints itself into awareness. Even when attention drifts, the memory of slow, cosmic rhythm remains available. The body remembers what it feels like to breathe without urgency, to exist without pacing itself against demand. Space becomes not just something observed, but something internalized, a steady reference point that the nervous system can return to whenever tension arises. In breathing with the universe, the body learns a quiet truth. Calm does not need to be created. It emerges naturally when the environment no longer signals threat. Space offers this environment completely vast, steady, and indifferent. And as the breath continues to slow and settle within this vastness, the entire system finds itself moving in harmony with something much larger, much slower, and deeply, unmistakably safe. As the body settles into safety and breath aligns with a slower rhythm, emotions begin to change in a subtle but important way. They do not disappear, and they are not pushed aside. Instead, they lose their sharp edges. Space does not numb feeling. It dilutes intensity through scale. When awareness rests within something immeasurably large, emotions are no longer required to occupy the entire field of experience. They become events rather than environments. The nervous system, no longer bracing for threat, allows feelings to arise without escalating them into states of alarm. On Earth, emotions often intensify because they are compressed by context. Social environments, confined spaces, and constant stimulation amplify feeling, forcing emotions to echo against narrow boundaries. Space removes these boundaries entirely. There is no surface for emotion to bounce back from. Sadness does not feel trapped. Worry does not feel cornered. Even excitement loses its agitation. The emotional system senses an environment where expression does not require defense or containment, and in response, it naturally moderates itself. This moderation is deeply biological. Emotional escalation is tied to perceived consequence. When the brain believes that a feeling will lead to immediate outcome, rejection, danger, loss of control, it amplifies that feeling to prepare action. Space offers no such consequences. The universe does not react emotionally. It does not respond to fear with threat or to sadness with withdrawal. This absence of feedback allows the emotional brain to relax its amplification mechanisms. Feelings can exist without needing to protect themselves. As emotions soften, they also become more fluid. Instead of locking into place, they move. A wave of feeling rises, lingers, and passes without being reinforced by thought or bodily tension. This fluidity is essential for regulation. Emotions are designed to be transient, but they become stuck when the environment signals danger or judgment. Space provides an environment free from both. In this context, emotional flow resumes its natural pattern, reducing distress without suppression. There is also a profound sense of permission embedded in cosmic awareness. Nothing in space demands emotional performance. There is no expectation to feel better, calmer, happier, or more composed. The absence of expectation removes pressure from the emotional system. When feelings are allowed without demand for change, they often change on their own. Space teaches the nervous system that regulation does not require effort, it requires allowance. As awareness remains wide, emotions no longer define identity. Feelings are experienced as states, not as truths. Anxiety is something that happens, not something that times is asterisk. Sadness passes through awareness without becoming a permanent condition. This distinction emerges naturally when the mind has enough space to observe rather than merge with experience. The universe provides that space effortlessly, allowing emotional identification to loosen without resistance. Over time, this way of relating to emotion becomes internalized. The mind learns that it can feel deeply without being overwhelmed. The body learns that emotional activation does not require physical defense. Together, they form a system capable of experiencing the full range of feeling while remaining stable. Space becomes an emotional regulator not because it changes what is felt, but because it changes the conditions under which feeling occurs. As emotions continue to arise within this vast context, they settle into proportion. Nothing needs to be pushed away. Nothing needs to be held tightly. Feeling becomes part of a larger flow, one that includes breath, thought, sensation, and silence. In this flow, the emotional system finally rests, supported by a universe large enough to hold every feeling without amplifying any of them. As emotional regulation settles into balance, the mind approaches a final and deeply calming realization. Rest does not require escape. There is no need to leave experience, silence thought completely, or reach some distant state where everything stops. Space teaches a different kind of rest, one that exists within continuity rather than outside it. The universe does not rest by shutting down. Stars continue to burn, galaxies continue to drift, time continues to unfold, and yet everything remains calm. In sensing this, the mind begins to understand that rest is compatible with motion, presence, and existence itself. Much of human exhaustion comes from the belief that rest must be earned by finishing, solving, or escaping. The nervous system remains tense when it feels that something must end before relaxation is allowed. Space quietly dissolves this belief. Nothing in the cosmos waits for completion before it settles into stability. There is no final task, no concluding moment after which calm begins. Calm is the baseline. Activity unfolds within it, not against it. When the mind absorbs this pattern, it releases the internal pressure to arrive somewhere else before it can relax. This realization has a powerful effect on mental fatigue. Thoughts no longer feel like obstacles that must be cleared. They become movements within a larger stillness. The mind stops pushing against its own activity. Instead of trying to silence thought, it allows thought to occur without resistance. In this allowance, effort drops away. The cognitive system conserves energy. Awareness becomes steady, open, and unburdened by the need to reach an endpoint. There is a profound safety in knowing that nothing needs to end right now. The future does not need to be resolved. The present does not need to be fixed. Even the self does not need to disappear for rest to occur. Space models this perfectly. The universe contains endless processes, yet none of them disturb its overall calm. The mind, recognizing this, begins to trust that it can remain awake, aware, and present without strain. Rest becomes something that happens times within times, experience, not after it. As this trust deepens, the body follows. Muscles release the last traces of holding. The face softens. The breath becomes slow and almost invisible. The nervous system enters a state where repair and restoration are prioritized. This is not collapse or shutdown. It is regulated stillness, the state the body naturally seeks when it is no longer anticipating demand. Space provides the clearest possible signal that no demand is coming. There is also emotional relief in this form of rest. Feelings no longer need to resolve into clarity. Ambiguity becomes tolerable. Uncertainty loses its threat. The universe does not resolve its mysteries before continuing, and neither does awareness. Emotional systems stop pushing toward answers and begin to settle into acceptance. This acceptance is not passive, it is stabilizing. It allows feeling to exist without driving action, and that permission is deeply soothing. Over time, This pattern becomes familiar. The mind recognizes that it can return to this state without effort, simply by widening its frame and releasing the need for conclusion. Rest is no longer something rare or fragile. It is something structural, supported by the same principles that allow the universe to remain coherent without constant correction. Awareness learns that it does not need to escape itself to recover. In this deep rest, without escape, the final layers of tension dissolve. Nothing is being resisted. Nothing is being pursued. Experience continues, but it no longer pulls attention forward or pushes it back. The universe holds everything in motion, and within that holding, the mind rests fully, not because it has stopped, but because it no longer believes that rest requires an ending. As awareness moves from bodily calm into cognitive ease, the mind begins to experience a different quality of thinking altogether, one that feels slower, clearer, and less burdened by effort. Space introduces immensity, not as a concept to be analyzed, but as a condition that reshapes how thought itself behaves. In an environment where scale exceeds comprehension, the brain naturally relinquishes its habit of micromanagement. It stops attempting to resolve every detail and instead adopts a broader, more tolerant mode of cognition. This shift does not reduce intelligence, it refines it, allowing clarity to emerge without pressure. The human brain is remarkably efficient, but it becomes strained when it attempts to hold too much specificity at once. Modern anxiety often stems from over-resolution, the urge to define, categorize, and predict every outcome. Space disrupts this urge by presenting a reality that cannot be fully resolved. When faced with immensity, the brain recognizes the futility of exhaustive control and gently changes strategy. It moves from precision to pattern, from detail to overview. In doing so, cognitive load drops dramatically, and thinking becomes smoother and less effortful. This broader mode of thinking is deeply calming because it aligns with how the brain evolved to process complex environments. Early human cognition balanced detail with horizon-scanning awareness of the wider landscape where threats or opportunities might emerge. Space activates this horizon-based processing in its purest form. There is no immediate task to solve, no close-range problem demanding resolution. The brain opens its field of awareness, distributing attention evenly rather than concentrating it tightly. Mental tension dissolves as thinking becomes spacious rather than compressed. As cognitive pressure eases, thought loses its compulsive quality. Ideas no longer push for immediate evaluation or decision. They arise, float briefly, and settle back into the wider field without demanding action. This is not indecision, it is cognitive rest. The mind recognizes that not every thought needs to be followed to completion. Space teaches the brain that clarity can exist without constant conclusion, and that understanding does not always require closure. There is also a reduction in mental conflict within this expanded frame. Many cognitive struggles arise from competing priorities, thoughts pulling attention in opposite directions, each claiming urgency. Cosmic scale dissolves this competition. Against an infinite backdrop, no single concern can dominate. The brain naturally deprioritizes internal conflict, allowing thoughts to coexist without friction. This coexistence is key to mental calm. When thoughts stop fighting for dominance, cognitive energy is conserved. This state supports a form of clarity that feels gentle rather than sharp. Insight arises not through forceful reasoning, but through alignment. Patterns become visible without being hunted. Connections are sensed rather than constructed. The mind begins to trust its capacity to understand without overworking. Space does not provide answers. It provides the conditions where answers are no longer demanded. In this condition, thinking becomes fluid, adaptive, and resilient. Over time, the brain learns to access this mode more readily. It recognizes the difference between narrow, effortful thinking and wide, effortless cognition. Cosmic imagery becomes a cue for expansion, signaling the mind to release unnecessary precision. This cue remains available even when attention returns to smaller scales. The memory of immensity lingers, reminding the brain that it can think clearly without tightening around every detail. As awareness continues to rest within this vast cognitive field, mental fatigue fades. Thought feels lighter, less insistent, more cooperative. There is room for ideas to breathe. There is time for understanding to arrive on its own terms. In the presence of immensity, the brain discovers a simple and restorative truth. When thinking does not need to control everything, it naturally becomes calm, coherent, and quietly clear. As awareness continues to expand within the immensity of space, the mind encounters a relief that is both cognitive and emotional, the gradual release of its need to control outcomes. Control is not a flaw in the human mind. It is a survival strategy refined over countless generations. Yet, when carried into every moment of modern life, it becomes exhausting. Space offers a condition where control is not only unnecessary, but irrelevant. Stars do not respond to intention. Galaxies do not adjust to preference. Nothing in the cosmos negotiates. In sensing this, the mind begins to unclench, releasing the constant effort of managing what cannot truly be managed. This release is subtle at first. The mind does not announce that it is letting go. Instead, it simply stops tightening around thought. The familiar impulse to predict, plan, and preempt softens. Ideas arise without immediately being organized into action. Possibilities are allowed to remain open without being resolved. This openness reduces cognitive strain. The brain conserves energy by abandoning unnecessary oversight, recognizing that not every variable needs to be tracked for safety to exist. Anxiety often intensifies when the mind believes it must maintain constant control to prevent negative outcomes. Cosmic scale quietly undermines this belief. The universe has never required human supervision to remain coherent. Its largest structures persist without intervention, guided by forces that do not pause for correction. When the mind absorbs this truth, it begins to question its own compulsion to oversee every detail of experience. The realization emerges not as logic, but as felt relief. Things can continue without constant management. This shift has a direct physiological effect. The body often mirrors mental control through muscular tension, a subtle bracing that prepares for intervention. As the need for control dissolves, this bracing relaxes. The jaw loosens, the hands soften, the shoulders drop. The nervous system no longer prepares for immediate action because action is no longer anticipated. Space communicates that nothing is about to demand response, and the body responds by releasing its grip. Cognitively, this release creates room for tolerance. Uncertainty becomes easier to hold when control is no longer demanded. Questions are allowed to remain unanswered without triggering discomfort. The mind stops rushing toward resolution and begins to trust that clarity does not always need to arrive immediately. This tolerance is deeply calming. It reduces the internal friction that arises when thoughts insist on completion. In a vast universe, incompleteness feels natural rather than threatening. There is also emotional relief in surrendering the illusion of responsibility for everything that happens. Space reminds awareness that existence unfolds according to patterns far beyond individual influence. This does not diminish agency where it matters. It removes the burden of false responsibility. The mind no longer carries the weight of believing it must anticipate and prevent every possible outcome. Emotional energy is freed, allowing feelings to arise without being immediately managed or suppressed. As control loosens, presence deepens, attention shifts away from future-oriented vigilance and returns to the immediacy of experience. The mind no longer scans constantly for what might go wrong. It observes what is happening now, supported by the understanding that nothing is required to change in order for safety to exist. This presence is steady rather than alert, receptive rather than defensive. It feels grounded, not because everything is known, but because nothing is being forced. Over time, the mind internalizes this pattern. It learns that control is optional, not essential. Space becomes a reference point for this learning, a reminder that stability does not depend on effort. Even when attention returns to smaller concerns, the memory of cosmic scale remains available, offering a way back to ease. The brain remembers that it can release its grip without falling apart. In this mental unclenching, clarity emerges without strain. Thought becomes cooperative rather than commanding. Emotions flow without escalation. The nervous system rests in a state of readiness that no longer demands vigilance. Space does not instruct the mind to let go. It simply demonstrates, through its vast indifference, that letting go is safe. And in that demonstration, the mind finally allows itself to rest from the exhausting task of trying to control what has never needed control at all. As control loosens and the mind unclenches, a deeper cognitive shift begins to unfold, the release of urgency around meaning itself. Much of mental strain comes not from thinking, but from the pressure to times make sense immediately. The mind is accustomed to extracting meaning quickly, labeling experience and deciding what matters now. Space interrupts this habit in a gentle but decisive way. In a universe that does not explain itself, meaning no longer needs to be seized on contact. It is allowed to emerge slowly or not at all, without consequence. When awareness rests on cosmic scale, the demand for instant interpretation fades. Stars do not announce their purpose. Galaxies do not justify their existence. The universe offers patterns without commentary and processes without instruction. The brain, sensing that interpretation is optional here, releases its constant evaluative tension. Thoughts no longer race to define significance. Experience is permitted to remain open-ended. This permission is profoundly calming because it removes the pressure to arrive at conclusions before the mind is ready. Urgency around meaning is closely tied to anxiety. When the mind believes that understanding must be achieved quickly to remain safe or competent, it accelerates thought, compresses attention, and amplifies uncertainty. Cosmic perspective dissolves this belief. Nothing in space becomes unstable because it is misunderstood. Nothing collapses because it lacks explanation. In recognizing this, the brain learns that meaning can unfold at its own pace without threatening coherence. Thought slows accordingly, releasing its compulsive drive toward resolution. This shift also alters how the mind relates to uncertainty. Instead of treating the unknown as a problem to be solved, awareness begins to treat it as a condition to coexist with. Space normalizes uncertainty by embodying it. Vast regions remain unseen, unmeasured, and unexplained. Yet the universe continues seamlessly. The brain internalizes this model. Uncertainty no longer triggers alarm. It becomes background rather than obstacle, allowing cognition to remain stable even when answers are absent. As urgency dissolves, meaning becomes less brittle. It is no longer something that must be secured through explanation or defended through logic. Instead, meaning arises through alignment, the quiet sense that experience fits within a larger, coherent whole, even if the details remain unclear. This alignment reduces cognitive friction. The mind stops pushing against ambiguity and begins to rest within it. Thoughts feel lighter, less burdened by the need to finalize their implications. There is also emotional relief in allowing meaning to remain incomplete. The pressure to define purpose, direction, or significance often weighs heavily on awareness. Space offers a different orientation. It demonstrates that existence does not require narrative to be valid. Stars exist without stories. Motion unfolds without intention. In this context, the mind releases the belief that it must constantly explain itself to remain grounded. Identity softens. Thought becomes observational rather than justificatory. This state supports a gentle clarity that does not demand certainty. Insights arise quietly, without fanfare, and are allowed to remain provisional. The mind becomes comfortable holding partial understanding without discomfort. This comfort is deeply restorative. It reduces the mental fatigue that comes from chasing definitive answers. Awareness settles into a rhythm where curiosity remains alive, but no longer pushes forward aggressively. Over time, the brain learns to trust this slower relationship with meaning. It recognizes that understanding deepens naturally when not forced. Space becomes a teacher, not by instructing, but by exemplifying patience. Even the largest structures reveal themselves gradually over immense spans of time. In aligning with this pace, the mind releases its urgency and discovers a quieter form of intelligence, one that listens more than it asserts, observes more than it concludes. In this way, the cosmos allows thought to rest without becoming empty. Meaning remains available, but it no longer demands pursuit. Experience continues to unfold within a stable, expansive frame where nothing needs to be resolved immediately. The mind relaxes into this condition, supported by a universe that does not hurry toward explanation and therefore does not require the mind to hurry either. As meaning releases its urgency, and thought learns to rest, the mind enters a final cognitive state that feels almost unfamiliar at first, thinking without direction, not confusion, not absence, but drift. In space, nothing moves toward a goal in the way human thought is trained to. Stars do not aim. Galaxies do not plan their paths. Motion occurs because conditions allow it, not because an outcome is required. When the mind absorbs this model, it gradually releases its habit of forcing direction onto every thought. Thinking becomes something that happens rather than something that must be steered. Much of mental fatigue arises from constant orientation. The mind is always asking where it is going, what comes next, and whether it is on track. This continuous navigation creates strain, even when nothing is wrong. Space removes the concept of track entirely. There is no correct direction in an infinite field. Movement does not imply progress or regression. It simply implies motion. As awareness rests in this idea, thought loosens its grip on trajectory. Ideas no longer need to lead anywhere to be allowed. They can arise, shift, and dissolve without being harnessed to purpose. This drifting quality has a profound calming effect on cognition. When thought stops demanding direction, internal resistance drops. There is no longer a need to decide whether a thought is useful, productive, or correct. Evaluation pauses. The mind becomes permissive rather than selective. This permission conserves cognitive energy. Instead of pushing thought forward or pulling it back, awareness allows it to float within a wider field. Mental effort decreases, not because thinking stops, but because thinking is no longer managed. Drift also dissolves internal conflict. Many mental struggles occur when thoughts pull in opposing directions, each insisting on movement. In a drifting state, direction loses importance. Thoughts no longer compete for dominance because no path needs to be chosen. They coexist without friction, passing one another like distant objects moving through space. This coexistence reduces mental noise. The mind experiences variety without chaos, movement without pressure. There is also emotional safety in undirected thinking. When thoughts are not required to go somewhere, they are less likely to trigger anxiety about outcomes. A thought does not imply action. An idea does not imply obligation. Awareness learns that cognition can exist independently of consequence. This separation is deeply regulating. It allows the mind to explore without bracing for result and to rest without fearing stagnation. As this state deepens, time perception shifts again. Without direction, there is no urgency to move forward. Moments feel longer, more open, less segmented. Thought unfolds at its own pace, sometimes slowing almost to stillness, sometimes drifting gently onward. There is no need to correct this rhythm. The mind begins to trust its natural flow, recognizing that coherence does not require constant guidance. Space demonstrates this continuously endless motion. No destination, perfect stability. This form of thinking is deeply compatible with rest and sleep. The brain no longer prepares for decision or action. Neural activity becomes more diffuse, less concentrated around control centers. Attention spreads evenly across awareness. This diffusion signals readiness for deeper relaxation. The mind is not trying to solve, plan, or conclude. It is simply present, allowing thought to move as gently as distant matter moving through the cosmos. Over time, the memory of this drifting state becomes accessible even outside cosmic contemplation. The mind recognizes the difference between forced direction and natural flow. It learns that not every thought requires steering, and that rest does not depend on stopping cognition entirely. Drift becomes a safe mode, one where awareness remains intact while effort disappears. In this final cognitive release, the mind aligns fully with the universe it observes. Thoughts drift the way stars drift. Ideas move without urgency, without destination, without demand. Nothing needs to be held, nothing needs to be pushed away. In this vast, permissive space, thinking becomes effortless again, not because it has ended, but because it no longer believes it must go anywhere at all. As the mind drifts deeper into cosmic awareness, time itself begins to change character. Not clock time, not measured seconds or scheduled hours, but psychological time, the felt sense of how quickly life seems to move and how urgently moments appear to demand resolution. In space, duration is so vast that urgency loses its meaning entirely. Billions of years pass without haste. Processes unfold so slowly that change feels almost indistinguishable from stillness. When the mind rests in this scale, its habitual hurry begins to dissolve, replaced by a steadier, more forgiving sense of time. Human stress is deeply entangled with compressed time. Deadlines, expectations, and future projections pull awareness forward, fragmenting the present into something to be endured rather than inhabited. The brain is trained to anticipate what comes next, often at the expense of where it already is. Cosmic duration interrupts this pattern completely. When awareness considers stars that burn for millions of years or galaxies that evolve across epochs, the idea that anything must happen soon begins to feel less convincing. The nervous system receives permission to slow because nothing in this environment accelerates. This shift has a direct impact on mental tension. Urgency activates stress circuits designed for short-term survival. Space deactivates them by removing the very context in which urgency makes sense. There is no deadline written into the universe. No moment arrives late or early. Everything unfolds according to conditions rather than schedules. As the mind absorbs this, it releases its constant forward lean. Attention settles into the present, not through discipline, but through irrelevance. The future no longer presses close enough to demand focus. As time expands internally, thought changes its rhythm. Ideas no longer rush toward conclusion. They stretch, unfold, and sometimes pause without discomfort. The mind discovers that it does not need to keep pace with imagined futures to remain safe. There is time, more time than can be exhausted. This realization is deeply calming. It allows awareness to linger, to rest inside moments rather than pass through them quickly. Mental fatigue begins to ease as the pressure to keep moving forward disappears. There is also emotional relief in releasing the fear of running out of time. Many anxieties are rooted in the belief that something must be resolved before it is too late. Cosmic time dissolves this fear by rendering too late meaningless. In a universe measured in billions of years, delay loses its threat. The mind relaxes its grip on outcomes, recognizing that immediacy is a local illusion rather than a universal requirement. Feelings soften as they are no longer framed by urgency. This expanded sense of duration also deepens presence. When time is no longer scarce, the present moment becomes sufficient. There is no need to extract value quickly or rush toward the next experience. Awareness can remain where it is without anxiety. Sensations become richer. Silence becomes fuller. The mind begins to inhabit time rather than race through it. This inhabitation is profoundly restorative, allowing cognitive and emotional systems to reset at their natural pace. As this state continues, the body mirrors the mind's temporal calm. Movements slow, breath lengthens, the heart settles into a steady rhythm. The entire system aligns with a sense of time that is generous rather than demanding. Nothing is being counted down. Nothing is being chased. Space demonstrates that duration itself can be safe, even comforting. The body responds by releasing its habitual readiness for the next moment. Over time, this relationship with time becomes internalized. The mind remembers that it does not need to hurry to remain coherent. Even when returning to daily rhythms, the imprint of cosmic duration remains available as a counterbalance to urgency. Awareness can widen again, touching that vast temporal field where nothing is rushed and nothing is lost by waiting. In time, without pressure, the mind finally rests from its constant forward pull. Moments are allowed to unfold fully, without being shortened by anticipation. The universe does not rush toward its future, and neither does awareness. Within this immense duration, mental hurry dissolves, replaced by a calm understanding that there is enough time always for experience to be exactly as slow as it needs to be. As the sense of pressure around time dissolves, the present moment itself begins to change texture. It no longer feels thin, fleeting, or unstable. Instead, it stretches gently and quietly into something wide enough to rest inside. In ordinary life, the present often feels like a narrow bridge between past and future, something to cross quickly before the next demand arrives. Cosmic time removes this tension entirely. When awareness is anchored in durations measured in millions of years, the present stops feeling temporary and starts feeling substantial. It becomes a place rather than a point. This stretching of now has a profound calming effect on the mind. Anxiety thrives when the present feels insufficient, when it seems unable to hold what is happening or protect against what might come next. Space changes this perception. In a universe where change unfolds slowly and predictably at scale, the present no longer feels fragile. Nothing is about to collapse. Nothing is about to demand immediate response. The mind relaxes because it senses that the moment it is in is stable enough to remain within. Neurologically, this experience reduces the brain's predictive overdrive. The mind spends much of its energy simulating future scenarios, constantly checking whether the present is adequate preparation for what lies ahead. Cosmic awareness weakens this loop. When the future feels distant, not just temporally, but existentially, prediction loses urgency. The brain stops racing forward and begins to settle into direct perception. The present moment becomes complete rather than preparatory. As the present stretches, attention deepens. Sensations are no longer skimmed, they are felt fully, without haste. Sounds linger longer. Silence becomes more noticeable. Even subtle bodily sensations are allowed to exist without being rushed past. This depth of attention is inherently calming. It anchors awareness in immediacy without tension, allowing the mind to rest inside experience rather than hover anxiously above it. There is also emotional safety in a present that feels wide. Feelings no longer need to resolve quickly. Sadness does not feel like it must end immediately. Calm does not feel like it must be protected before it disappears. Space teaches the emotional system that states can exist without being fragile. The present can hold them without breaking. This holding reduces emotional urgency, allowing feelings to arise and settle at their own pace. As this perception stabilizes, the mind stops negotiating with time. There is no internal bargaining, just a little longer, just until this passes. Awareness recognizes that it is already where it needs to be. The present does not need to be escaped or optimized. It is sufficient as it is. This recognition removes a deep layer of existential tension, one that often remains hidden beneath surface thoughts. The body responds immediately to this shift. When the present feels safe, muscular guarding releases further. The breath becomes slower and more regular, no longer tied to anticipation. The nervous system enters a state where repair and integration are prioritized. This is not sleep, but it is the threshold of deep rest, a condition where nothing is being prepared for and nothing is being avoided. Over time, this expanded present becomes familiar. The mind learns that it can return to this state simply by widening its temporal frame. The universe provides an endless reference point for this widening, a reminder that the present does not need to be rushed because it is embedded in something vast and stable. Even brief contact with this perspective can soften urgency and restore calm. In the stretching of the present, the mind discovers a quiet truth. Peace is not found by escaping time, but by allowing time to open. The universe does not compress its moments, and neither does awareness need to. Within this wide, patient now, the mind finally rests, not waiting, not anticipating, but simply existing in a moment that is large enough to hold everything gently, without pressure or hurry. As the present stretches and becomes safe to inhabit, the mind encounters another subtle transformation. Duration itself begins to feel like shelter rather than threat. In everyday experience, long time horizons often provoke anxiety. The future looms, the unknown expands. Questions about direction, purpose, and outcome grow heavier the farther they extend. Space reverses this relationship entirely. In cosmic context, duration is not something pressing toward you. It is something that surrounds you. Time no longer advances like a force. It exists like an environment wide, continuous, and non-demanding. Existential tension frequently arises when the mind feels exposed to time, as though it must keep up with it or justify its place within it. The universe dissolves this exposure by demonstrating that nothing is required to keep pace. Stars exist across durations so vast that individual moments lose their sharpness. Entire civilizations could rise and fall unnoticed within a single cosmic cycle. When the mind absorbs this scale, it releases the belief that every moment must carry weight. Time becomes forgiving. Existence feels less fragile. This shift alters how the mind relates to meaning and continuity. In compressed time, the mind often feels pressure to define significance quickly to ensure that experiences add up, that progress is being made. Cosmic duration removes this accounting. There is no rush to accumulate meaning when time itself is abundant beyond comprehension. The brain relaxes its evaluative systems, recognizing that coherence does not depend on immediate synthesis. Life does not need to justify itself moment by moment to remain valid. Duration also softens the fear of impermanence. When time feels short, change feels threatening. Loss feels absolute. Space reframes impermanence as participation in a longer flow rather than disappearance. Stars are born and fade, yet the universe remains. Forms change, yet structure persists. This perspective reassures the mind that continuity does not require permanence at the level of individual moments. Something larger holds everything together, even as parts transform. As this understanding settles, existential anxiety begins to loosen. The mind no longer feels isolated in time, standing alone between a vanished past and an uncertain future. Instead, it feels embedded within duration, carried rather than exposed. Time becomes a medium that supports existence rather than a force that erodes it. This embeddedness is deeply calming. It allows awareness to rest without bracing against what comes next. There is also relief in recognizing that nothing essential needs to be completed quickly. The universe does not hurry toward resolution. Processes unfold until they no longer need to, and then something else begins. The mind internalizes this rhythm. Goals soften, narratives loosen, the pressure to arrive diminishes. Experience becomes something to participate in rather than something to finish. Emotionally, this produces a gentle stability. Feelings are no longer intensified by the sense that time is running out. Sadness does not feel terminal. Calm does not feel fleeting. Everything is allowed its duration. This allowance reduces emotional reactivity and supports a more balanced, resilient state of mind. The nervous system responds by maintaining regulation rather than oscillating between urgency and exhaustion. As awareness continues to rest in this long horizon, identity itself becomes less tense. The self no longer needs to be defended against time. It exists within it, shaped by it, but not threatened by its passage. This reduces a deep, often unspoken anxiety, the fear of being overtaken or left behind by time. Space shows that nothing is left behind. Everything remains part of the whole as long as it exists. In duration, as shelter, the mind finally finds a place to rest that does not depend on certainty, permanence, or control. Time becomes expansive rather than consuming. The future stops pressing forward, and the past stops pulling backward. Awareness settles into a wide temporal field where nothing is rushing and nothing is ending prematurely. Within this field, existential tension dissolves quietly, replaced by a calm understanding that existence unfolds within time, not against it, and that this unfolding in itself is safe. As duration becomes shelter rather than threat, the mind reaches a final and deeply stabilizing relationship with time, the realization that continuity itself is restful. Time no longer feels like a countdown moving toward loss, exhaustion, or ending. Instead, it feels like a steady field within which everything gently unfolds. The universe does not move from moment to moment with urgency. It flows. Processes overlap. Beginnings and endings blur into continuity. When the mind aligns with this pattern, it releases its fear of time as something that is constantly running out. Much of human stress is rooted in countdown thinking, the belief that something must happen before time expires. This belief keeps the nervous system in a state of low-grade alarm, always anticipating a moment when it will be too late. Space dissolves this structure completely. There is no final moment toward which everything rushes. Even endings in the cosmos are transitions rather than conclusions. Stars collapse, but elements scatter and form something new. Nothing disappears abruptly. The mind, sensing this continuity, relaxes its grip on urgency. This shift changes how awareness experiences the passage of moments. Time no longer slices experience into before and after. It becomes a continuous presence rather than a sequence of disappearing opportunities. The present does not feel like it is slipping away as soon as it arrives. It feels held within something larger. This holding reduces the subtle panic that often accompanies awareness of time passing. The mind no longer feels chased by the next moment. It rests where it is without fear of losing ground. As countdown pressure dissolves, thought loses its compulsive forward pull. The mind stops rehearsing what must come next in order to feel safe. Planning becomes optional rather than mandatory. Attention remains with experience rather than racing ahead of it. This shift dramatically reduces cognitive fatigue. The brain no longer expends energy tracking imaginary deadlines. It conserves resources, settling into a state of sustained, low-effort awareness. Emotionally, this continuity brings profound relief. Feelings are no longer framed by the fear of ending too soon or lasting too long. Calm does not feel fragile. Discomfort does not feel permanent. Everything exists within a larger flow that does not demand resolution. This reframing stabilizes emotion without suppressing it. The emotional system senses that it does not need to rush toward relief or brace against persistence. It can simply be present. The body mirrors this change immediately. When time no longer feels like a countdown, muscular tension releases further. The breath becomes slower and more even, no longer shaped by anticipation. The heart settles into a rhythm that feels sustainable rather than reactive. The nervous system enters a state where vigilance is unnecessary because nothing is approaching a critical threshold. The body finally understands that it is not running out of time to be safe. This relationship with time also softens identity. The self is no longer defined by progression, milestones, or timing. There is no pressure to be ahead or fear of falling behind. Existence feels adequate without comparison. The mind stops measuring itself against imagined timelines. In a universe where continuity is the rule, presence is enough. This realization removes a deep layer of existential strain that often goes unnoticed until it disappears. As awareness continues to rest within continuity, rest itself becomes continuous. There is no sharp boundary between effort and recovery, thinking and stillness, waking and drifting. Everything blends smoothly. This is why cosmic awareness is so compatible with deep rest and sleep. The brain no longer prepares for a final moment before which something must be resolved. It allows itself to let go gradually, safely, without fear of missing anything important. In resting inside continuity, the mind finally understands that time is not something to race against or escape from. It is something to exist within. The universe does not count down toward meaning. It unfolds it endlessly, and as awareness aligns with this unfolding, the last traces of hurry dissolve. Nothing is ending too soon. Nothing is arriving too late. Time holds everything, and within that holding, the mind rests deeply, steadily, and without resistance. As time settles into continuity and pressure dissolves, the mind encounters a quiet transformation in how it experiences itself. Identity, which often feels dense and demanding, begins to lose its weight. In everyday life, the sense of self is reinforced constantly through roles, expectations, memories, and future projections. The mind carries this structure everywhere, maintaining it through effort and vigilance. Space offers a different context entirely. In a universe vast beyond comparison, identity no longer needs to be carried so tightly. It becomes lighter, less central, and far less demanding. This lightening does not erase the self, it softens it. The universe does not ask who you are, what you do, or where you are going. It does not require definition to allow existence. When awareness rests in this indifference, the mind gradually releases the belief that it must constantly reinforce its identity to remain coherent. The self stops feeling like a structure that could collapse if attention wavers. It becomes something more fluid, present, but not burdened by constant maintenance. Much of mental strain comes from defending identity. Thoughts revolve around how one is perceived, remembered, or evaluated. This defense requires energy. It keeps attention narrowed and alert. Cosmic perspective dissolves this defensive posture. Against the scale of galaxies and cosmic time, personal narratives lose their urgency. Not because they are unimportant, but because they are no longer threatened. The universe does not contest them. It does not challenge or validate. In this neutrality, identity relaxes. This relaxation has a direct calming effect on the nervous system. When identity is under threat, the body prepares for action, tightening, bracing, and monitoring. When identity feels safe without effort, the body releases. Muscular tension decreases further. The breath deepens naturally. Awareness widens. The self is no longer experienced as something that must be protected from every moment. It is allowed to exist quietly within a much larger context. There is also relief in realizing that identity does not need to be continuous to be real. In cosmic awareness, moments arise without reference to who they belong to. Experience unfolds without constant labeling. Sensation happens. Thought happens. Feeling happens. The self no longer needs to narrate ownership over every event. This absence of constant self-reference reduces cognitive load dramatically. The mind rests because it no longer needs to insert itself into everything it experiences. As identity lightens, comparison fades. In a universe without ranking, there is no position to maintain, no scale on which the self must be measured. This removes a deep and often unconscious source of tension. The mind stops tracking whether it is ahead, behind, or aligned with expectation. Existence becomes non-competitive. Awareness settles into presence without evaluation. This is not loss of motivation. It is relief from unnecessary pressure. This state also softens emotional reactivity. When the self is less rigid, emotions pass through more easily. A feeling does not threaten identity. A thought does not redefine worth. Everything is allowed to occur without being absorbed into a personal narrative. This separation stabilizes emotion. The mind can feel without becoming overwhelmed because the self is no longer tightly bound to every internal event. Over time, the mind learns that identity can be flexible without dissolving. It can loosen without disappearing. Space provides a model of this flexibility. Structures exist, but they are not rigid. Galaxies bend, expand, and shift while remaining coherent. The self mirrors this pattern. It remains present, but it no longer resists change or demands reinforcement. This flexibility is deeply calming because it removes the fear of internal instability. In identity without weight, awareness finally rests from the effort of being someone. Existence does not require constant definition. The universe holds everything without asking for explanation. And within that holding, the mind discovers that it too can exist without effort. The self becomes lighter, quieter, and more spacious, not because it has been reduced, but because it no longer needs to carry the burden of proving itself in a universe that has never required proof at all. As identity lightens and the self no longer carries so much weight, another shift quietly follows. Worries begin to shrink without being argued away. They are not denied, reframed, or corrected. They simply lose scale. In everyday awareness, worry grows because it fills the available space. When the mental field is small, concern expands until it touches every edge. Cosmic perspective enlarges the field so dramatically that worry no longer has anywhere to dominate. It becomes proportionate, contained, and far less intrusive. This reduction happens without judgment. Space does not tell the mind that its concerns are trivial. It offers no comparison designed to invalidate feeling. Instead, it places worry within a context so vast that urgency naturally dissolves. The brain stops treating every concern as central because the environment no longer reinforces centrality. Attention spreads outward, and as it does, the emotional charge carried by worry thins. The nervous system relaxes because nothing appears immediately consequential. Worry thrives on proximity, the sense that something is close, imminent, and unavoidable. Cosmic awareness removes this proximity entirely. Problems are no longer felt as pressing inward. They appear at a distance, visible but not surrounding. This distance is deeply regulating. It allows the mind to observe concern without merging with it. The brain's threat systems quiet because the perceived environment does not suggest imminent danger or demand rapid response. As perspective widens, the mind also releases its habit of magnification. Small uncertainties no longer escalate into large narratives. A single thought does not spawn endless prediction. This is not suppression. It is containment through scale. Just as a sound dissipates in open space, worry dissipates in a wide mental field. It does not vanish instantly, but it loses momentum. The mind becomes less sticky, less inclined to repeat the same concern over and over. There is also emotional relief in recognizing that not everything requires resolution right now. Cosmic perspective demonstrates patience without instruction. Stars do not resolve their futures in advance. Galaxies do not worry about their eventual shape. The universe unfolds without rehearsal. In sensing this, the mind releases its compulsion to anticipate every outcome. Worry no longer feels like preparation. It feels unnecessary. This realization allows attention to settle rather than spin. As worries shrink, space opens for neutrality. The mind can acknowledge a concern without assigning it emotional priority. This neutrality is deeply calming because it restores choice. Attention can move away from worry without force. The brain no longer treats disengagement as avoidance. It understands that nothing dangerous follows from letting a concern remain unresolved for now. Safety no longer depends on mental rehearsal. Over time, this way of relating to worry becomes familiar. The mind learns that it can widen its frame whenever concerns feel overwhelming. Vastness becomes an internal tool, not a strategy, but a condition. Even brief contact with cosmic scale reminds awareness that no single issue can occupy everything. There is always more space available than worry can fill. As this perspective stabilizes, emotional energy redistributes. The body feels lighter. The breath remains slow and steady. Thoughts regain their flexibility. Worry may still arise, but it no longer governs attention. It becomes one movement among many within a vast field of experience. In perspective beyond the self, the mind finally understands that calm does not require eliminating concern. It requires context. Space provides that context effortlessly, a scale so wide that nothing needs to be dismissed for peace to emerge. Worries remain acknowledged, but they no longer feel defining. Within the vastness of the cosmos, attention rests easily, supported by the simple truth that no single thought is large enough to disturb the whole. As worries shrink and perspective widens, the mind encounters a form of relief that is both subtle and profound. The relief of not being central. In ordinary awareness, the self often feels like the focal point around which everything turns. Events are interpreted in relation to personal consequence. Thoughts revolve around impact, responsibility, and outcome. This centrality creates pressure. When everything feels oriented toward the self, even small disturbances can feel significant. Space dissolves this orientation entirely. In a universe without a center, the mind releases the burden of being the axis of meaning. This release does not diminish value or importance. It removes weight. The universe does not organize itself around individual perspective, and nothing collapses because of this. Stars do not orbit attention. Galaxies do not adjust their paths in response to observation. When the mind absorbs this truth, it relaxes its assumption that everything happening nearby is happening times because of times it, or times 4 times it. This reduction in self-reference immediately lowers stress. The nervous system no longer treats every event as a personal signal requiring response. Stress often arises from the sense that one must constantly matter, must be relevant, impactful, or decisive. Cosmic perspective offers a gentler alternative. It shows that existence can be meaningful without being central. Things can matter without revolving around you. This understanding is deeply soothing. The mind no longer needs to maintain a state of readiness to influence outcomes. It releases the belief that constant engagement is necessary to justify presence. As self-centrality softens, internal dialogue quiets further. Thoughts no longer loop around what this means for me or what I must do next. Attention moves outward into observation rather than inward into evaluation. The mind becomes less performative and more receptive. This shift reduces cognitive effort dramatically. The brain no longer needs to simulate countless personal consequences. It rests in awareness rather than anticipation. There is also emotional relief in this decentralization. Feelings lose their intensity when they are no longer framed as defining. A difficult emotion does not threaten identity. A passing worry does not demand action. Everything becomes less personal, not in a dismissive way, but in a stabilizing one. The emotional system senses that it does not need to escalate feeling to protect the self, because the self is no longer positioned as fragile or exposed at the center of events. This perspective also reduces social tension. Many anxieties are amplified by imagined scrutiny, the feeling of being seen, judged, or evaluated. Cosmic awareness dissolves this entirely. The universe does not observe in order to assess. It does not watch. It does not keep record. In this absence of scrutiny, the mind releases a deep layer of vigilance. There is nothing to perform for, nothing to maintain. Presence becomes effortless rather than guarded. As awareness continues to widen, humility emerges naturally, not as self-reduction, but as balance. The self finds its place within a larger system rather than above or against it. This placement is stabilizing. It removes the strain of exaggeration, both positive and negative. Success and failure lose their dramatic charge. Everything becomes part of a larger flow that does not hinge on individual outcomes. This understanding is deeply calming because it removes the sense that everything is at stake. Over time, the mind learns to return to this state whenever stress intensifies. It remembers that relief is available not by becoming more important, but by becoming less central. Space offers a permanent reference point for this, remembering a reminder that nothing requires you to carry the universe on your shoulders. In the relief of not being central, the mind finally rests from the exhausting task of self-importance. Existence continues perfectly without demanding constant relevance. The universe holds everything in motion without privileging any single point. And within that vast, balanced structure, awareness relaxes deeply, supported by the quiet understanding that it is allowed to exist without being the center of anything at all. As the sense of centrality dissolves, the mind encounters a final and deeply soothing shift in how it experiences belonging. No longer defined by position, status, or comparison, belonging becomes something ambient, something that exists without conditions. In ordinary life, belonging is often measured. One belongs more or less, better or worse, inside or outside. The mind keeps score constantly, comparing itself against others, against expectations, against imagined standards. Space removes the entire framework in which comparison operates. In the cosmos, nothing belongs more than anything else. Everything that exists already belongs, fully and without qualification. This realization has a profound calming effect because comparison is one of the most persistent sources of mental strain. The brain evolved to compare in order to navigate social hierarchies, but in modern life, this mechanism rarely rests. Thoughts measure success, adequacy, progress, and worth against endlessly shifting reference points. Cosmic awareness dissolves these reference points entirely. There is no ladder in space, no ranking, no outside position from which something could be excluded. When the mind absorbs this, the impulse to measure begins to fade. Belonging in the universe is not earned and not granted. It is automatic. A star does not belong because it shines brightly. A planet does not belong because it is useful. Even dust belongs. Even emptiness belongs. This unconditional inclusion communicates safety at a deep psychological level. The mind no longer needs to evaluate whether it is enough to remain included. Existence itself is the only requirement, and that requirement is already met. The nervous system responds by releasing a layer of vigilance. it has carried quietly for years. As comparison dissolves, self-judgment softens. Thoughts no longer constantly assess where the self stands. Attention stops scanning for evidence of adequacy or failure. This does not produce apathy. It produces ease. The mind becomes less reactive because it is no longer defending a position. It no longer needs to justify itself through achievement or identity. Belonging is no longer something to secure. It is something already present, like gravity, invisible but reliable. There is also emotional relief in realizing that difference does not threaten inclusion. In space, everything is different. No two stars are the same. No two orbits identical. Diversity is not an exception. It is the structure. The mind internalizes this model and releases the fear that difference implies separation. One does not need to conform to belong. One does not need to match a standard to be held within the whole. This realization gently dissolves social anxiety and self-consciousness without requiring confrontation or correction. As belonging becomes unconditional, the mind's relationship with others changes as well. Competition loses its grip. Envy softens. Comparison no longer drives attention because it no longer offers security. The emotional system stabilizes as it recognizes that inclusion is not scarce. There is no limited space to occupy, no threshold to guard. Everything that exists already fits. This abundance removes a deep layer of interpersonal tension that often goes unnoticed until it disappears. The body mirrors this shift immediately. When the need to measure dissolves, muscular tension releases further. The chest opens. The breath remains slow and unguarded. The nervous system stops preparing for evaluation. There is nothing to prove and no position to defend. Presence becomes relaxed rather than performative. Awareness rests in itself without scanning for comparison points. Over time, this way of belonging becomes familiar. The mind learns that it can exist without constantly referencing itself against others or against imagined ideals. Cosmic awareness leaves an imprint, a quiet certainty that inclusion is not fragile. Even when attention returns to daily life, this certainty remains accessible, offering a way back to ease whenever comparison reappears. In belonging without comparison, the mind finally releases one of its heaviest burdens. There is no need to measure worth, progress, or place. The universe does not compare its contents, and yet it holds them all effortlessly. In aligning with this truth, awareness settles into a deep, stable calm, grounded in the simple understanding that to exist is already to belong, completely and without condition. As belonging settles into something unconditional and comparison fades into irrelevance, the mind approaches one of its deepest fears with unexpected gentleness. The fear that letting go means losing something essential. In everyday awareness, surrender often feels dangerous. To release control, identity, urgency, or attachment can feel like disappearance, collapse, or failure. Space teaches a radically different lesson. Nothing in the universe holds on tightly, and yet nothing is lost. Stars release their fuel, galaxies stretch and thin. Even matter itself transforms endlessly without vanishing from existence. When the mind senses this pattern, surrender begins to feel safe rather than threatening. This safety arises because cosmic surrender is not abandonment. It is continuity through change. The universe does not cling to forms, yet it never dissolves into nothing. Processes unfold, structures transform, and still the whole remains coherent. When awareness absorbs this, it releases the belief that letting go equals erasure. The mind begins to understand that release can coexist with stability. One does not need to hold tightly in order to remain intact. This realization alone dissolves a profound layer of unconscious tension. Much of mental strain comes from guarding against loss of meaning, of identity, of control, of relevance. This guarding keeps the nervous system alert, braced against imagined collapse. Space offers no such warning. Nothing in the cosmos resists transformation, yet nothing disappears into chaos. When the mind rests in this truth, it loosens its grip. Thoughts no longer cling to outcomes. Emotions no longer insist on permanence. Awareness begins to trust that continuity does not require constant preservation. This trust changes the texture of thought itself. Ideas arise without being immediately secured. Feelings pass without being captured. Even silence becomes more comfortable because it no longer implies absence. The mind stops scanning for what might be lost if it relaxes. It learns, quietly, that letting go does not empty experience, it opens it. Cognitive effort drops as attention no longer needs to monitor itself constantly. There is also deep bodily relief in this form of surrender. The body often mirrors mental holding through muscular contraction, subtle tension that prepares to defend or retain. As the mind releases its fear of loss, the body follows. The chest softens, the abdomen releases, the breath flows without interruption. The nervous system exits its protective stance because it no longer perceives relaxation as risky. Space communicates, at the most basic level, that release is not followed by harm. Emotionally, surrender without loss creates a sense of quiet courage. Feelings are no longer resisted or clung to. They are allowed to move freely through awareness, changing shape without threatening stability. Sadness does not need to be pushed away. Calm does not need to be preserved. Everything is permitted to arise and fade within a larger holding that does not collapse. This permission stabilizes emotion more effectively than control ever could. As awareness continues to rest in this perspective, the fear of disappearance fades. The self no longer feels like something that could vanish if attention softens. Identity becomes flexible, not fragile. Presence remains even as narratives loosen. Space demonstrates that existence does not depend on fixation. It depends on participation in a larger flow that never stops. Even as forms change, over time, surrender becomes natural rather than intentional. The mind no longer asks whether it is safe to let go. It simply does. There is nothing dramatic about this release. It feels ordinary, quiet, almost unnoticed, like a hand unclenching after realizing it no longer needs to hold anything. Awareness rests more deeply because it is no longer guarding against an imagined fall. In surrender without loss, the mind finally releases its last resistance. Nothing essential is threatened by letting go. The universe proves this endlessly through expansion, transformation, and quiet persistence. And as awareness aligns with this truth, it settles into a profound calm, grounded in the simple understanding that release does not erase existence. It allows it to continue, gently and safely, exactly as it always has. As surrender settles into safety, awareness moves one step deeper into calm, into trust. Not trust in outcomes, plans, or guarantees, but trust in process itself. In ordinary life, the mind feels responsible for holding everything together. It tracks, monitors, anticipates, and corrects, believing that coherence depends on constant attention. Space quietly contradicts this belief. The universe does not supervise itself moment by moment, and yet it remains ordered, continuous, and stable. When the mind senses this, it begins to release its exhausting role as caretaker of existence. This release does not happen through logic or reassurance. It happens through exposure. Cosmic processes unfold without oversight. Stars regulate themselves through balance, not control. Galaxies organize through gravity, not intention. Even expansion follows consistent principles without being directed. The mind absorbs this model slowly, and in doing so, it starts to question a deeply ingrained assumption that if attention relaxes, something will fall apart. Space demonstrates the opposite. Stability can arise from alignment rather than effort. Trusting a larger process reduces a subtle but constant strain on cognition. Much mental fatigue comes from the sense that something important might be missed if vigilance drops. This belief keeps awareness tense, scanning for errors or threats. Cosmic perspective dissolves this vigilance by showing a reality where nothing depends on being watched. The universe does not collapse when unobserved. The mind, sensing this, allows its alert systems to stand down. Thought becomes quieter because it no longer needs to patrol experience. As trust deepens, the relationship between thought and action changes. The mind no longer feels compelled to intervene immediately. Pauses become comfortable. Silence between thoughts no longer triggers anxiety. Awareness rests without preparing to act. This is not passivity. It is confidence without effort. The brain recognizes that not acting does not equal danger. In fact, in a stable environment, inaction can be the most efficient state. Emotionally, trusting a larger process softens fear. Fear often arises from the belief that something essential depends entirely on personal management. When that belief loosens, fear loses its foundation. The emotional system no longer escalates feeling to force attention. Calm becomes sustainable rather than temporary. Feelings arise and pass within a wider container that does not demand response. This containment allows emotional energy to settle instead of cycling endlessly. There is also relief in releasing responsibility for coherence. The mind often feels tasked with making sense of everything, ensuring that experiences connect, that life has continuity, that nothing drifts into chaos. Space offers a gentler truth. Coherence can exist without explanation. Patterns hold even when they are not understood. The mind begins to rest from its constant effort to integrate, allowing understanding to emerge gradually or not at all without distress. As trust replaces control, the body responds immediately. Muscular holding releases further. The breath remains slow and uninterrupted. The nervous system shifts fully into a state of rest and repair. There is no longer a background readiness to intervene. The body senses that it is carried by something stable rather than suspended over uncertainty. This sensation is deeply soothing, allowing physiological systems to recover more completely. Over time, this trust becomes internal. The mind learns that it does not need to oversee its own processes constantly. Thoughts can arise and settle without supervision. Attention can drift without losing coherence. Awareness becomes self-supporting rather than self-policing. Space leaves an imprint, a quiet confidence that existence unfolds reliably, even when not managed. In trusting the larger process, the mind finally rests from its most exhausting task, trying to hold everything together. The universe does not ask for this effort, and it never has. As awareness aligns with this truth, it relaxes into a calm that feels both deep and ordinary, grounded in the simple understanding that nothing essential depends on constant attention, and that letting the larger process unfold is not only safe, but natural. As trust in the larger process settles into awareness, the mind reaches a threshold where effort quietly gives way to stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness that emerges when resistance ends. For most of life, the mind resists rest without realizing it. It prepares, anticipates, reviews, and adjusts, even when nothing is required. Space offers an environment where resistance has no function. There is nothing to brace against, nothing to anticipate, nothing to correct. In sensing this, the mind does not decide times to rest. It simply stops holding itself upright. Stillness arrives naturally, like a body floating when it realizes it no longer needs to swim. This falling into stillness feels different from relaxation achieved through effort. There is no instruction, no technique, no deliberate slowing. The mind does not attempt to become calm. It simply ceases the actions that prevented calm from being present. Thoughts lose their push. Attention loses its forward lean. Awareness settles downward into itself, guided by gravity rather than intention. This is why cosmic imagery is so effective for deep rest. It does not ask the mind to change. It removes the conditions that kept it tense. Much mental activity exists solely to prevent collapse, to keep the self oriented, relevant, and prepared. Space demonstrates that collapse is not a threat. Nothing falls apart when vigilance drops. The universe remains coherent without constant input. When the mind truly senses this, it releases its last layer of resistance. Thought no longer tries to stabilize experience. It allows experience to stabilize itself. This release is profound because it resolves effort at its root rather than managing its symptoms. As resistance fades, inner movement slows dramatically. Thoughts appear farther apart. Silence between them becomes wide and comfortable. Awareness rests in these intervals without trying to fill them. This silence is not blankness. It is presence without commentary. The nervous system recognizes this state as deeply safe. Stress hormones recede. The body enters a condition similar to the moments just before sleep, where consciousness remains, but effort has disappeared. Emotionally, this stillness is stabilizing rather than numbing. Feelings do not need to be resolved or expressed. They are held gently in a wider awareness that does not react. Anxiety cannot sustain itself without resistance to push against. Sadness does not deepen without narrative to reinforce it. Calm becomes the dominant tone not because it is imposed, but because nothing is disturbing it. Space provides the ultimate non-disturbing context. There is also a deep sense of permission in this state. the mind realizes that it is allowed to stop doing without something going wrong. This permission is rarely granted in daily life. There is always something else to attend to, something else to consider. Cosmic awareness removes that demand entirely. Nothing is waiting, nothing is expected. The mind finally accepts that rest does not need justification. It does not need to be earned. It can simply happen. As stillness deepens, awareness becomes less localized. The sense of being behind the eyes or inside the head softens. Experience feels more distributed, more spacious. The boundary between observer and environment blurs gently. This diffusion is deeply calming because it reduces self-focus without eliminating awareness. The mind feels held rather than contained. There is room to exist without tension. Physiologically, this state allows deep restoration. The brain shifts towards slower wave patterns associated with relaxation and early sleep. The body prioritizes repair, digestion, and immune balance. This is not collapse into unconsciousness, but a glide toward it, a controlled, natural descent where awareness is allowed to fade gradually. Space does not pull the mind into sleep. It creates conditions where sleep becomes the most natural continuation. In falling into stillness, the mind completes its journey. There is nothing left to release, nothing left to trust, nothing left to manage. Awareness rests exactly where it is, supported by a universe that has never required effort to remain whole. Stillness is no longer something to seek. It is something that remains when resistance ends, and in the vast, quiet presence of space, resistance finally disappears completely. As stillness settles fully and resistance has disappeared, awareness reaches its most natural state, a state where separation gently dissolves. Not the loss of consciousness, not disappearance, but the quiet end of division. In ordinary experience, the mind positions itself times here asterisk, observing something times there asterisk. This separation sustains effort. It requires orientation, distinction, and constant reference. Space offers an environment where this division becomes unnecessary. There is no clear boundary to maintain, no edge where awareness must stop and the universe begins. In sensing this, awareness relaxes its habit of standing apart. This dissolution does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds gradually as the mind notices that nothing requires separation to remain coherent. The universe does not fragment because parts are not distinguished. Everything exists within a single, continuous field where boundaries are functional rather than absolute. When awareness mirrors this structure, it stops isolating itself as a point that must observe from a distance. Experience becomes less about looking times at times and more about being times within asterisk. This shift is profoundly calming because it ends the subtle tension of constant orientation. Much mental effort is spent maintaining the sense of me here, world there. This distinction supports survival, but it also sustains strain. The mind must constantly track position, relevance, and relationship. Space removes the need for this tracking. There is no foreground demanding focus, no background requiring exclusion. Everything exists in the same vast continuity. Awareness, sensing this, releases its reference points. It no longer needs to locate itself precisely. Presence becomes diffuse, spacious, and effortless. As separation dissolves, thought loses its anchor. Inner narration fades almost completely, not because it is suppressed, but because it no longer serves a function. Language depends on division, subject and object, observer and observed. When these distinctions soften, words lose urgency. Silence becomes rich rather than empty. Awareness rests without needing to name what it experiences. This nameless presence is deeply soothing to the nervous system, which no longer needs to categorize or defend perception. Emotionally, this state brings a sense of profound ease. Feelings arise within the whole rather than against it. There is no isolated self for emotion to threaten or protect. Anxiety cannot anchor itself without separation. Calm does not need to be preserved because nothing is opposed to it. Everything feels allowed, held, and supported by a context so large that nothing can overwhelm it. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional safety without boundaries. The body responds as though it has finally arrived somewhere familiar. Tension dissolves completely. The breath moves so softly it almost disappears. The heart settles into a slow, steady rhythm that feels self-sustaining. The nervous system enters its deepest state of regulation, a state where vigilance is unnecessary because there is nothing external to guard against. Awareness no longer scans, it rests. Time, too, loses its structure here. Moments no longer follow one another sharply. Experience feels continuous, like a single, unbroken presence. There is no sense of waiting for the next moment or holding on to the last. Everything unfolds within the same gentle now. This timelessness is deeply compatible with sleep because the brain no longer tracks progression. It allows consciousness to soften and fade without fear of interruption. In this state, the idea of control becomes meaningless. There is nothing separate to control and nothing outside that could disrupt. Awareness does not manage itself, it simply exists. This is the deepest form of rest, not collapse, not escape, but integration. The mind is no longer doing anything to maintain calm. Calm remains because nothing is disturbing it. As awareness dissolves into the whole, the last traces of effort vanish. There is no center and no edge, no observer and no observed, just presence, wide and quiet, resting within itself. The universe does not hold awareness. Awareness is part of the universe holding itself. And in this final release, the mind completes its journey, settling naturally into the deepest rest it knows, not by going somewhere else, but by finally stopping the act of standing apart.